with our discussion of influential American Jews, which is obviously a vast subject. And I just kind of have really just picked people that I found were interesting, some of whom are well known, some of whom are not so well known. If you were here last week, we did some people that probably you'd never heard of, like Rabbi Ray Frank, although she wasn't technically a rabbi. She's often considered the first female rabbi in America, unofficially, and then later helped found Hillel. So we picked some kind of obscure people, but today I'm going to have some I guess a little bit more well known. At least, actually, maybe some of them aren't so well known, but then we're going to kind of do a deep dive on one of them. I thought would be interesting. But let me start here. Let me pull up my my presentation. Here we go. And then I'm gonna share in a second, but I want to look at some various themes. But let me okay. I'm going to share my screen in a second. Let's see. I got two screens here. Okay, Zoom and share screen. Okay. Where's influential American Jews? Oh, here we go. Okay. So some of the bigger picture issues that I just want to make sure we kind of get across is that Jewish life in America is very rich and varied. We talk about, I think I said this last week, 90% of American Jews today are Ashkenazic Jews, which means largely they are descended from people who immigrated between 1880 and 1920. And then, of course, there was, the little bit of post-war migration. Then there was a little bit, obviously, the Russian Jews in the 80s and 90s, but the vast majority date from that period. However, there are Sephardic Jews who date back to the 1600s, and German Jews from the 1830s and 1840s. So there is a kind of there's a wide spectrum, even though we tend to think of sort of Ellis Island and the immigrant experience and the Lower East Side and Maxwell Street in Chicago. That is one predominant narrative experience of American Jewry, but it's not the full one. Also, Zionism, and obviously this is very important today, the role of Israel, and we're gonna do a little bit more of that in a couple of weeks. We're gonna look more closely at the role of Israel in the life of American Jews, because that seems very pertinent right now. Obviously very pertinent. So that exerted a huge influence, and we're going to look at some of the key figures in that in a couple of weeks. And then, this is the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, or really the beginning of the 20th century is probably more accurate. America was a relatively small Jewish population compared with the world. The majority of Jews lived in Europe, Central, Western, Eastern Europe. And American Jews were a relatively small population. By the end of the 20th century, so that's within our lifetime, so forth, American Jews were the largest Jewish population in the world. Now that has switched. Israel now is the largest, not by much. It's very comparable. They're basically about 6 million each. It depends on how you count. It's complicated counting, because there are people who are who are considered Jewish in America, but who some Orthodox rabbis in Israel would not consider Jewish. And there are people that are considered Jewish in Israel who may not be Jewish. There was a lot of people from Russia who immigrated and aren't Jewish. So it's a tricky counting, but basically the two populations are fairly close, with Israel being slightly larger. But by the end of the 20th century, the American Jewish community was the largest Jewish community in the world, which was a vast change from the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, the Holocaust is the primary reason for that, because the Holocaust decimated European Jewry, especially Eastern European Jewry. 90% of Eastern European Jewry was killed and murdered in the Holocaust. So, but what this does is it highlights the importance of the American Jewish experience. And where are we today? Obviously, we'll get to that. So, some of these key themes. Now, who do I want to talk about next? This may be somebody that you have heard of, probably not, but has anyone heard of Rabbi Joshua Loth Liebman? Anybody? Well, okay. He is a very interesting guy, and he actually served in Chicago. He was the rabbi of KAM for a brief period of time. In fact, I just conducted the funeral 2 weeks ago of Michael Weinberg Jr., there's a Michael Weinberg III, who's a member of our congregation. This is his father, who was 98 and a half. And he had sent me a letter a few years ago, which I saved. He talked about how he had been a member of KAM when Rabbi Liebman was the rabbi there. And this was in the 30s. So he was a rabbi at KAM in the 30s before he went to Boston, where he was the rabbi of Temple Israel in Boston for about 10 years, before he died tragically early. I mean, he died in 1946. He was in his 40s. So it's a very sad early death. He was in his 40s. But what's so important about Rabbi Loth Liebman is that he wrote the first bestseller by a rabbi that was a specifically Jewish content. He wrote a book published in 1945 called Peace of Mind, and it was a huge bestseller. And what it did was it integrated psychoanalysis, psychology, therapy with Judaism. So before his career, oftentimes science and religion were seen as contradictory, opposites, that the world of science, especially psychology, was moving away from the world of religion, that we were uncovering basic truths about human beings and not living in the naive, idealized world of religion. Freud is the classic example of this. He was a very strong atheist, proudly Jewish ethnically, but not at all religiously. Liebman brought together these two fields. And he said, spirituality, like therapy, like psychology, when used together, can help bring peace of mind to human beings and help bring comfort and understanding and reduce pain and live more fulfilling lives in the world. And this was extremely important after World War II. The book was published right at the end of World War II. After America had gone through this conflict, after obviously European Jewry, and people didn't know the extent of the Holocaust yet, but it was a time of great loss, millions of lives lost around the world. And here was this rabbi who was able to write this book that was appealing to people of all religions, but came from a Jewish perspective. Kind of like what Harold Kushner did with When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and that's in 1981. This was a very similar phenomenon, but this is in 1945. And he was a very, very interesting figure. First of all, he was one of the very first, he talked about undergoing psychoanalysis when he was in Chicago. So he was a patient of a guy named Dr. Brinker, who was the head of psychiatry at Michael Reese Hospital, which is, of course, a very famous Chicago hospital, which was very Jewish in the 30s and 40s. And Dr. Brinker had been one of the last patients of Freud. So here was this, he was sort of, he had this deep psychological understanding of himself and of what the tools were for improving life. And he talked about that openly, and he wrote about it. And he was also speaking at a time when people were becoming more and more open to looking at therapeutic solutions to issues. That the kind of there was just a greater openness to this way of thinking, and he appealed to that. Today we take it for granted. Today, I mean, today people, there's Dr. Phil and Oprah, and there's pop psychology everywhere in our culture. But at this time, that didn't exist. But people were becoming more open to it. So he spoke this new language in a very appealing and powerful way. And he was an extraordinary speaker. People said if he had lived longer, he would have been the Jewish Billy Graham, which is a great description. This is of him. He was a very powerful speaker. And in fact, Life magazine did a whole feature story about him and his family. He and his wife adopted a girl who had been a Holocaust survivor and orphaned during the Holocaust, who came to America, and they raised her. She actually became a very well-known child psychiatrist in Boston. So he was really an extraordinary person, and he exerted great influence with this book. And it kind of, he was in one biography I read of him, they said he was sort of the first Jewish icon in America. He was really widely respected as a Jewish religious figure, one of the very first to have this sort of general culture acceptance. And that's very, there were people like Gershwin and others who were Jewish, but they weren't known for their Judaism. He was known for being a rabbi, for his Jewishness. And that was a big first in American culture. And it's interesting, even in some religious fundamentalist circles today, psychology is kind of verboten. You don't talk about psychology. That's, everything comes from God. You should be able to endure any pain and suffering you have. That's just not enough faith. And he shattered that idea, and was, if you might have heard of some Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote a very famous book called The Power of Positive Thinking. This was that same genre, although Liebman was even earlier. Had he lived longer, he probably would have been as famous as Norman Vincent Peale, but tragically he died early. Couple other things. Yeah, I've talked about this. It's interesting. He had a very difficult life. His parents were divorced, which was rare. Obviously, he was raised in the 1910s, 1920s, probably, or actually more like 1910s. Divorce was not common. And so he had a difficult childhood. And he came from an Orthodox Jewish family, but it had become Reform early. His grandfather was actually one of the very first Reform rabbis in Germany. He went to college at age 15, so he's clearly very bright. So he was sort of the right person to write this kind of book. By the mid-1940s, he was on the radio. He had 2 million listeners. So as I said, he was a very influential figure. A couple interesting, let me just read this, and I'd like to know if you have any questions or what you think. Both science and religion teach us that the obstacles to serenity are not external. They lie within us. If we acquire the art of proper self-love, if aided by religion, we free ourselves from shadow fears and learn honestly to face grief and transcend it. If we flee from immaturity and boldly shoulder adult responsibility, if we appraise and accept ourselves as we really are, how then can we fail to create a good life for ourselves? For then inward peace will be ours. It's beautiful. Could have been written today. And again, we often think, you probably heard that famous Jewish joke, start worrying, details to follow. Jews are notoriously, we are a religion of oi more than joy. But here he's saying, find a little joy, be accepting, be loving. Questions about this? All right, I'll share one more. This is good. Many people are miserable because they think that occasional destructive feelings necessarily make them terrible persons. But just as Aristotle maintained, one swallow does not make a spring. We must understand that one or two or even a dozen unadmirable traits does not make an unadmirable person. Long ago, Edmund Burke warned humanity about the dangers of false generalization in society, of judging a whole race by a few undesirable members. Today, we should likewise become aware of the generalization about our individual personality. A splendid freedom awaits us when we realize that we need not to feel like moral lepers or emotional pariahs because we have some aggressive, hostile feelings towards ourselves and others. When we acknowledge these feelings, we no longer have to pretend to be that which we are not. It is enough to be what we are. We discover that rigid pride is actually the supreme foe of inner victory, while flexible humility, the kind of humility that appears when we do not demand the impossible or the angelic of ourselves, is the great ally of psychic peace. You see, what's so interesting about this is not, we probably get these ideas, but first of all, this was not common in the culture at the time. Secondly, he's writing with an intellectual depth. I mean, you can pick up pop psychology books today, and they're pretty simple. They're almost like like Hallmark cards. He's writing with real insight, and you can see from the language and the quotes, he's got a depth to his understanding, and he was sharing that. He was sharing that with the world as a rabbi, which was quite unique. Any questions or comments? Okay. Now I'm going to move to another, probably more famous figure. I'm sure you've all heard of Abraham Maslow. Who hasn't heard of Abraham Maslow? Okay. Maslow taught at Brandeis. It's very interesting. So he was, and Brandeis University, interestingly, Brandeis was a very important university for American Jewry because it was founded when a lot of the top universities, Harvard, Yale, had quotas on Jewish students. And so students who in a different age, if they were a different religion, would have gotten into Harvard or Yale, didn't get in, and many of them would go to Brandeis. So Brandeis had sort of it was punching above its weight in a way, in the students it attracted. So he really was an influential figure. And what he's most famous for is the hierarchy of needs, which I found here, and I will share it. Let me pull up where I had it saved here. Let's see, where did I put that? Here we go. So you've all probably seen this chart before. You have the pyramid. You have physiological needs, food, water, warmth, rest. We all know that. That's basic. Safety, security, safety. I mean, obviously you can't help right now. You think about what's going on in Israel. The conflict is over these basic needs, security, safety. That's why there's so much anger and fear in Israel that was basically violated. Obviously, life as well. Then, as you move up, you get belongingness and love, friendship, community. I mean, what's so interesting about Maslow is everyone knows that we have these basic needs. But Maslow said these are also needs. Community is a need. It's not just an extra. It's not just something fun. This is a basic, we're social animals to a degree. So we have psychological needs. And even more so, after this sort of basic community needs, is esteem, a feeling of accomplishment and prestige. We don't need to be the best in the world, but we need to feel something like we are accomplishing something important. Just like in any job, doesn't matter if you're a garbage man or, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, everybody needs to feel some sense of doing something important, contributing. Again, there are exceptions. There are some sociopaths in the world. We know that. But most people have a need, as Maslow would point out, for some sense of of contributing, of doing something for the world. And then at the very top is self-actualization. So this is creativity. This is doing something and adding your own twist or uniqueness to it that is fulfilling for you. This could be somebody who, who's an artist and is able to create something unique and different. You could be a tennis player, and that's, maybe that's not your career, but it's your passion and you become very good at it. I mean, this could really be anything, but it's taking something within you and maximizing it. And so what was so important about Maslow is he extended the idea of human needs. That's quite interesting. I'd be interested in your perspective. Why were so many of the kind of pioneering psychologists, therapists in America Jewish? Why do you think that is? I have a couple ideas, theories, but it's basically still true today. Not, it's not really totally true today. It's probably, but it was true largely through the 20th century. Why do you think that is? Any ideas? Yeah, Todd?
So, putting aside all the jokes about Jewish neuroses, obviously, just simply from a philosophical standpoint, I mean, all our sources talk about internal struggle, and then we accept the idea of internal struggle, whether it's the Yetzer Hara, and the Yetzer HaTov, and that really got incorporated into Jewish thought. I think Christianity kind of wrote off the human struggle in certain ways with the concept of original sin, because original sin basically says it's bad and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
Jews, kind of took a look at these issues and said, yeah, it can be bad, it can be good, it's a struggle, but we can make some good out of it. And I think because of that study coming out of Orthodoxy, coming out of our sources for the last couple thousand years of study, I think had a definite impact on our thinking.
That's great. So that's sort of a Jewishly internal reason that we never had the concept of original sin or the devil. I mean, we have a sort of a concept of Hasatan, the adversary, but not in the same way that Christianity does. Christianity could say, "Oh, the devil took hold of me." Whereas in Judaism, we say there is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that's within us. And so these psychological tensions are within us, and we can probe them, explore them, look at them. That's great. There's an internal Jewish sort of depth of understanding of humanity that, we don't pretend that most people are saints. In Christianity, sainthood is an ideal. In Judaism, there's Moses. We know Moses has an anger problem. Moses is not perfect. He has a terrible anger problem. Jacob is not perfect. He lies and, basically tricks his brother into giving him the birthright. Our heroes are not perfect. They're human. And so we understand that kind of complexity of the human experience. Yeah. Sue?
Well, your question too about why so many psychologists or psychiatrists seem to be Jewish. I think Jewish people in the medical field found a real need among our people because of all the years of anti-Semitism. I mean, there were the pogroms that people escaped from in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And then, of course, there was the Holocaust. And people lost faith and wondered if there really is a God. Well, where is this God? How could this happen to us? And I think people had a real need for psychological counseling and to find themselves and to find a reason for being in this world that had caused them so much suffering.
Very good. Very good. So there was a huge need after the experiences of anti-Semitism, of the Holocaust, of suffering. And even more so is the immigrant experience, that Jews were both insiders and outsiders. and that can come insiders in the sense that except for the very first generation of American Jews, who lived on the Lower East Side, American Jews were pretty successful pretty fast. The Jews were sort of a one generation working class community. And again, that's not everybody, but it's generally true. But even though we were successful on an economic, financial level, Jews were not socially accepted really until the 1990s, well, arguably. So Jews were insiders in the sense that they had achieved a certain level of success and comfort in America, and yet they were outsiders. I mean, the author who captured this best is Philip Roth. I mean, a lot of his books are about this insider-outsider status. He has this famous short story called Eli the Fanatic, which is a beautiful story. It's in his book, I think it's Goodbye Columbus. And, it's the story of this successful Jewish guy living in suburban New York and Long Island in a very upscale community in a beautiful house and so forth. And suddenly a black-hatted Orthodox family shows up and starts walking in the neighborhood. And we kind of take that for granted now. I mean, we see in Highland Park even, but this is in the 50s. And he is just totally, his whole world is upended by this Orthodox guy in the community because he was an insider and an outsider. And so that psychological pain or confusion, maybe is the right word for that, made Jews kind of aware there was an internal tension. There was an internal tension from being insiders in one way, but also profoundly outsiders in another way. And so all of that combined, really, it's remarkable. I read this book called Jews in the American Soul. It was published about 15 years ago. And it was all about how not only Maslow, but so many of the earliest psychologists in America who he taught, I have the book. I have sort of notes from the book somewhere around here. Let me, Jews in the American Soul. I mean, so many of the early psychologists, let's see his table of contents here. Were Jewish. There's Liebman. Who else? He has so many others. I forget. Marcus Jastrow, whose son became a very famous psychologist. Erik Erikson. We know the Erikson Institute in Chicago. Very important, beautiful building in the Gold Coast. Erich Fromm. I mean, all of these very highly regarded figures came from serious Jewish backgrounds. Erich Fromm is quite interesting in that regard. So I think we nailed it. All of the internal parts of Judaism that was open to study of the human psyche without whitewashing it. I remember one time I spoke to a group of students from Wheaton College and about the Hebrew Bible, about Torah. And I was getting into the characters of Jacob and Moses, and they were shocked that I would say somewhat critical things about these biblical characters. When they speak about figures from the Gospels, it's always that these were shining examples of everything good. And so it's a very different way of understanding humanity. And I think that it's been a kind of a part of Judaism. Okay. Other comments or questions? Okay. So we've let's see. The other, yes, this is a very interesting kind of a successor to Rabbi Liebman, someone who actually also was very friendly with Maslow, was a rabbi named Milton Steinberg. Has anyone heard of Milton Steinberg? Yeah, Todd. So Milton Steinberg wrote a very famous fiction book called As a Driven Leaf. It's a beautiful book. If you ever want to read a great Jewish themed novel, I think he wrote it in the 50s. It's about a rabbi who sort of becomes a heretic, but remains close with with his teachers. So he's sort of an insider outsider. Again, that sort of parallels the American Jewish experience. But Milton Steinberg, like Liebman, brought a kind of psychological depth to his rabbinate. And he was the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, which is still a beautiful synagogue. And he wrote, he was one of the first American rabbis to write about the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara in a psychological context. So I'm sure you probably heard these terms before, but in Judaism, the rabbis, the Jewish sages, divided our personality into the Yetzer HaTov, which is the good inclination. See, Tov is good, Yetzer is inclination. The good inclination, that's the loving, when you have a child, you have a loving inclination towards that child. Well, again, there are sociopaths in the world, we know this, but most people, you give birth, you have a loving feeling. You have a loving feeling towards your parents, towards, there's a human connection. There's a part of us that yearns for connection. That's a Yetzer HaTov. But we also have a Yetzer Hara. That's the evil inclination, the bad inclination. The evil's a better translation. And that's the aggressive instinct, what Freud called the death instinct. This is the part of humanity that wants to hurt others, that is destructive. And again, everybody has this. Some people have it worse than others. But everybody has it. And what the rabbis said is that we wouldn't build civilizations, create families, if we weren't able to channel the energy of the Yetzer Hara, the power of the Yetzer Hara, towards positive ends. What Freud called sublimation, that you take the energy, you take the destructive tendencies and you take the energy behind them and you channel it for the good. It's kind of like addiction. People who are addicted to alcohol or drugs or something, they often become like, if they get over the addiction, they become like serious, like runners and athletes. This is not uncommon. It's because it's almost like that negative, destructive energy has now been channeled to something more positive. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. But it's obviously a matter of personality. But it's taking the pain and turning it into something productive. And Milton Steinberg wrote about that as a psychological phenomenon using these parts of Judaism, the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara. And there's a beautiful midrash that says, I think it's the second day of creation, and it says, most days it says, and it was good. On the second day of creation, it says, and it was very good, Tov Ma'od. And the sages, the Jewish sages in the Midrash said, why was this day very good, whereas the other days were just good? And their answer was, because on that day, God created the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And you think about it, say, what? Why would it be good that God created the evil inclination? Because the energy behind the evil inclination is what leads human beings to do extraordinary things. So this is it's a beautiful way of thinking. This is a very counterintuitive, yet profoundly powerful way of looking at the world. And Steinberg kind of brought this out to the general public. Yeah, it's kind of Jung. Carl Jung did a similar thing, not obviously using Judaism. He was an anti-Semite, unfortunately. Not a terrible anti-Semite, but he was an anti-Semite. But he talked about the shadow side of human beings. And this is a kind of similar. This is the shadow part of human beings. And no person is complete without their shadow. Questions about this? Yeah, Todd, go ahead.
So Steinberg obviously was there in what, the 40s?
40s and 50s. Unfortunately, he died early also. He had a very sad marriage. His wife was an alcoholic, and she became very mentally ill, was institutionalized, and died early, and he died shortly thereafter. It was, his own life was sort of a tragedy. But yes, he was the 40s and 50s.
So he wrote Basic Judaism. Is that where you think most of his stuff on Yetzer Hara is coming from?
Yes, and also he had a lot of unpublished writings that were eventually published in journals, like the Reconstructionist. This is where, so some of his journal articles are really where he fleshed it out. But Basic Judaism is a great book. It's sort of an introduction to Judaism book. He has a little bit about Yetzer Hara in there, if I remember correctly, but it was more in his kind of articles. Yeah.
So Cosgrove obviously is very recent, and you know him, obviously, having written for him as an editor.
He's a wonderful rabbi, yeah.
But I mean, he's a young guy, obviously. But who was between Cosgrove and Steinberg, if you know?
There were two. There was a guy named Judah Natick, who was a fairly well-known. He had been a World War II chaplain, and then there was a guy who was before Cosgrove. So Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove. It's a good friend of mine. He's the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue now. This synagogue is so remarkable. They raised $18 million for Israel in one weekend. They're not lacking well-off people. It's on Park Avenue Synagogue, but there was before Cosgrove was a guy named David Lincoln, who was a British guy. But Steinberg was kind of a uniquely intellectual figure, very highly regarded. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you're ever going to speak about Natish, but he wrote a 2-volume series on basically legends of the Jews, and a lot of very interesting stuff there about the sages.
That's great. I haven't read that. Very good. Very good. All right, let's move on to another kind of interesting post-war figure, who actually has a Highland Park connection. I believe a Solel connection, actually. Legacy. I believe his second wife had been a member of Solel. He died a few years ago. His name was Richard Rubinstein. And he was very famous in the 60s because he was sort of the most prominent Jewish proponent of a school of thought, theology, revolving around the idea that God is dead. This was a big theological movement in the 1960s, which was kind of influenced by the Holocaust, but really came to its own in the 60s. And the idea was the kind of benign view of the universe, of a loving God in the heavens, making sure everything goes well, in control of everything. That God never existed, and if he did exist, was murdered by the atomic bomb and the Holocaust. And this was very prominent in Christian theology as well. This was a huge thing in Christian thought. But Rubinstein was the most prominent Jewish figure associated with this movement. And he really wrote a lot about the Holocaust. He was one of the first Jewish thinkers to really grapple with the theological implications of the Holocaust. Because very interestingly, after World War II, very few American Jews discussed the Holocaust until the early 1960s. It was almost like post-traumatic stress disorder. You just sort of bury it. There was a series on NBC in the late 40s that kind of that was a documentary about it, but that was it. There were no Holocaust memorials. There were very few books. There weren't articles about it. It was almost like American Jews had to set it aside and build up a life before really grappling with its implications. And people started to grapple with it in the early 60s. Then in the 70s, when Elie Wiesel wrote Night, that kind of really pushed it further. But Rubinstein was one of the first to say all of our ways of looking at the world have been shattered by the Holocaust. And he wasn't, what was interesting, what made him different than the Christian theologians, is some of the Christian theologians of God is dead were basically saying it's time to leave religion altogether. But Rubenstein said, actually, I'm just as strongly Jewish as before, but my Judaism is purely based on survival. And he said, he didn't put it this way, but one of his friends, who was an Israeli, German, and then Israeli theologian named Emil Fackenheim put it, of the 614th commandment. You know, there are 613 commandments in the Torah, and Emil Fackenheim said there's actually a 614th commandment. And that 614th commandment was, thou shalt not give Hitler a posthumous victory. In other words, Jews must survive. And for Rubenstein and for Fackenheim, they were very strong Zionists. I mean, so most of American Jewry was by the 60s, but they were very much that a strong Israel is the key to Jewish survival. Religions don't really matter. Synagogues don't really matter, but community matters, and a state, a strong state matters. So this was obviously, this has been a very influential way of thinking. There are many people, I'm sure you know some of them, I certainly do, who really are not at all interested in religious Judaism. They don't belong to a synagogue. Some may belong to a synagogue as a purely philanthropic thing, and that's fine, you know. I'm happy if they can contribute and keep a synagogue going, great. But many of them really do not care at all about religious life, but they are proudly Jewish because they care about Jewish survival and they care about Israel. And that derives very much from this kind of philosophy that Rubenstein wrote about. Still very powerful. Questions about this? Yeah, Todd, go ahead.
Just as kind of a background, I mean, the conservative movement kind of started out with the sociology of Judaism. Then you saw Kaplan really coming out of the conservative movement, emphasizing almost exclusively the sociological element of Judaism. Yeah. Where do you, and obviously this is an extension of that, because again, it's the, you know, looking at Jews as a people.
Yes.
I guess if you take a look at the two major definitions of who's a Jew, it's, you know, do you have a belief system, or do you are you part of a people? And it's those who emphasize the peoplehood as a concept. Where do you see that going? I guess today with current thinkers.
Well, it's still very powerful, and I think this is a very good kind of point to make. Judaism is not a religion. I mean, it's a people with a religious system at its core, but, you know, in the entire Hebrew Bible, from Torah to prophets, there's no word for religion. Jews are a people. We have a belief system and set of practices associated with that, but we are a people, a culture, an ethnicity. And that is different than Christianity. Christianity starts off specifically as a religion. It is, well, it starts off as a branch within Judaism, but it becomes a new religion by being universal, by leaving the, I mean, what made Christianity leave Judaism was that it dropped the ethnic part of Judaism. It kept the one God, but it dropped the ethnicity part of it and became universal. So ethnicity, culture, peoplehood has always been an essential part of Judaism. And I think anti-Semitism, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is one of those external phenomena that has helped make peoplehood central to Judaism. You know, we become more connected to our people in times of difficulty, like we are right now. I mean, I just tell you anecdotally, I see people that are, you know, would barely talk about anything Jewish or Israel related in normal times, are suddenly posting on Facebook and things all the time, you know? So this, sometimes when an awful thing happens, it brings people closer together. And so because we have such a long history of anti-Semitism, that has made Jewish peoplehood central. Now, for a long time, many people thought that the peoplehood part of Judaism was declining because, first of all, we have much more interfaith marriage. That's a given, and so when you have people that don't have that ethnic background, you do lose some of that shared memory, shared history. And that's certainly true, although the truth is it hasn't really made such an impact. And as anti-Semitism was declining through the 1990s, people thought the ethnic component of Judaism would also decline because there's no external foe keeping Jews together. Obviously, that thesis has proved wrong, as startlingly wrong, as we just saw a few weeks ago. But that was just, that's just the latest in a series of anti-Semitism. So the peoplehood aspect of Judaism remains quite strong. And that's surprising to a lot of people. People didn't think, 25 years ago, people didn't think that would be true. But today it's very true. Yeah, Sue? Oh.
Okay, I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, Rabbi. When you say Judaism is not a religion, it's a peoplehood. Originally, my question is, weren't we originally, way back at the beginning of Torah and the beginning of our history, weren't we called Hebrews?
Yes.
And
yes.
so then the Judaism came, I believe, from Judea.
Yeah.
And so as Hebrews it wasn't a religion, it was a people.
Right.
And I think am I correct in that assumption?
Very much so. Although the truth is, nobody really knows exactly what the origins of the Jewish people are. Where the question, where Judaism started, how did this group of the Hebrews, where did they come from and how did they form? Nobody really knows exactly. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. No.
And when you talk about people who care so much about the survival of the Jewish people because they were born Jewish, and I will tell you, in my family, I have two brothers who are very, very devoted to the way Jews are supposed to live.
Yeah.
But neither one of them go to services. They aren't interested in the ritual, but boy, are they interested in cultural Judaism.
Yeah.
And have raised their children as Jews. And at one time did belong to temples. And I don't know how they got that way, because our parents weren't like that. But one of them is a scientist, so that tells you. But it's interesting. I think that's very common.
Very common. And thankfully, America is still a religious country. Europe is not religious at all. Europe, less than 5% of Europeans ever go to church. American religious practice is declining, but we still are much more religious than Western Europe. So even people that are not very religious, they may belong to a synagogue just to give their kids a bar mitzvah or something, and that has a positive effect. Even if they don't always stay members, it actually has a positive effect. Studies have shown this. But American Jews are generally much more secular, even though they're committed. Now, but the origins of Judaism, or of the Hebrews, is a very interesting question. There's one theory that says the Hebrews were a breakaway group of Egyptians that were followers of an Egyptian noble who sort of revolted against the Pharaoh, and that then left Egypt. That's where the story of the Exodus comes from. That's one theory. Doesn't have that many supporters. Most people think that the group that became known as the Hebrews, and then ultimately Jews, were Canaanites who lived in a section up in the hills, sort of in the Judean hills. There were other groups that lived there, but this was a group that lived and in various settlements, and they had certain dietary practices that were different than other groups. Now, nobody knows why they had this, but for example, there are certain archaeological sites in Israel that were known to be sites of this early group of Canaanites known as the Hebrews, where you will find no pig bones. Whereas in other neighboring sites, not far away, but that were populated by a different ethnic group, there are pig bones. So there was some group that had certain taboos, cultural taboos, that they carried over. And then this group, the Hebrews, they were Canaanites. They were a group within, and somehow this group survived, whereas other groups didn't. Why did they survive and other groups didn't? Well, that we don't know. I mean, it's you read Torah and you see all of these stories about one group, the Jebusites, the Hittites, all these groups. None of them exist anymore, but the Hebrews do. It obviously goes through various phases and evolutions, transformations. So we don't start as a religion. We start as a people. How did our religion develop? That's another interesting question. In the Torah, it's just like Abraham had this flash of insight and comes to an understanding of one God, and then God reveals these laws at Mount Sinai. Is that the actual story of how Judaism evolved? Who knows? But over time, we developed certain cultural practices that distinguish Jews. And the challenge today, I guess to get into this, because this is, if you don't, what religion does is religion creates obligation. If you feel obligated to fast on Yom Kippur, to remember Yortzeit, to observe Shabbat every once in a while, to celebrate something on the Jewish holidays, if you feel obligated, you'll do it, and your children will see you do it. But if Judaism is purely an ethnicity, then that makes it harder to pass on. People who are Irish, you might know from their last name, but generally they don't really pass on Irish culture unless they make a deliberate, concerted effort to do so, and that's rare. Yeah, sure, you have some exceptions. You have Irish bars and Irish festivals and things like that, but that's more like marketing and surface level. It's almost like the bagels and lox version of Judaism. Sure, that's nice, but that doesn't have much depth to it. So that's the real challenge. If it's purely ethnic Judaism, how do you pass that on? And that's where religion comes in. Religion creates a sense of obligation. So, but if you think about it now, in a world of increasing anti-Semitism and what we just saw in Israel, that makes passing on ethnic Judaism somewhat easier. My mom was asking me the other day, she's, because the Reform Rabbinical School, it's really kind of pathetic. They barely have any students right now. I think they have like 12 students in the incoming class. It's just awful. It's just, the rabbinical school is just in terrible shape, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We don't go into it sometime, but so my mom was asking me, do you think more people now that with what's happening in Israel, will more people apply to the school? I don't think so personally, because I don't think that really motivates people, but I do think that more people will get interested in Jewish life. I think that people, when your family is threatened, when your people who are like you is threatened, even if you're not that into Jewish observance, you feel some sort of connection and feeling. And so I think that in many ways, anti-Semitism strengthens Jewish identity. Obviously, we all want anti-Semitism and terrorism to decline and to be gone. but that's not the world we live in. So in some ways, it's easier to pass on Judaism in difficult times, tragic as that might be. Other questions, comments? Okay, well, we'll pick up next time with Rabbi Emil Hirsch. He'll be our next subject. And then in 2 weeks, we'll go into more Zionism. We'll really look closely at some of the great American Zionist thinkers. So I'll see you all next week.
When you do talk about Emil Hirsch, interestingly, and you may want to mention some of the other Sinai rabbis